Welcome, everyone, to another bonus episode of the Poisons and Pestilence podcast. This week, we're doing a bit of World War I, and in particular, we're looking at the evolution of UK's gas strategy during that conflict. And I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Jess Morris. Hello, Jess.
Hi, are you alright?
I'm very excited. I've been reading your thesis, and I've read it a few months ago, and I've read it again now. And Jess has written this wonderful master's thesis on the history of this issue.
Yeah, so my master's thesis was studying the operational use of gas on the Western Front in 1917 by the British Army. And unsurprisingly, that resulted in a huge rabbit hole. And I just found it fascinating, the idea that this weapon that so many people view as a failure, partly because of Loos in 1915 that everybody knows, is actually used on such a mass scale. And it's just that sort of question of why? Why do we focus on this one failure when clearly there's an entire conflict full of sort of case studies to study? And I could have written 2 or 3 more theses from the research, because there's just so much out there that I feel like people really need to sort of dig into.
The nice thing is, so I'm enjoying where we are in the plot at the moment. It's been a while, but currently it's because I'm lost in Renaissance Italy writing on poisons, and that's still in the 16th century. And by this rate, we won't get to the First World War for another 2 years, but I'm endeavouring to push on. So it's very nice to kind of be looking at what's on the horizon for the series as I've read this. So as we're here then, let's do this properly. So why don't we start, as every good historical discussion should, with a kind of introduction to the broader context of gas and why chemical weapons emerged during the First World War. And in your project, we're focusing particularly on the British perspective.
With the First World War especially, we see the deadlock, there's a stalemate happening all along the Western Front especially. And no matter what we seem to be doing, nothing was breaking that. And it took the 22nd of April 1915 and Germany releasing chlorine gas for something to start to change. And with this particular case study, I think that's important to remember that when the Germans did this, they did it with extraordinary effect. And this is why we, sort of the British Army, tried to replicate that, because when the Germans managed it, they were breaking gaps along the lines, somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 yards in length, which I don't know about you, but I'm terrible at visualizing lengths. But when you realize that's about 30 football pitches per gap, you realize the number of men that were fleeing the lines is huge. And so you can see why the British Army turn round after April 15 and go, we need to redo this because the war could end. Obviously, that unfortunately did not happen. But this also isn't the start of chemical warfare being discussed. I mean, in your podcast alone, you sort of mentioned that this is tinkering in the background for centuries, and the British alone have been looking at this as early as 1812.
And yes, I was going to say, what's interesting about this first use is, in many respects, it has parallels with much earlier schemes. So we've, of course, Charles Stevenson has come on and talked about the sort of the Napoleonic era planning sulfurous smoke and sulfurous gas. But what was interesting, of course, was this was the era in which there had been some discussion of the use of deleterious gases in warfare and things like poison projectiles. But there's actually an atavist kind of quality of the first use of chemical warfare at a major scale, ignoring for a second, experimentation with tear gas on the front. Because this was basically large drums from which huge amounts of chlorine were released. The drums that we used wouldn't have looked out of place in an industrial setting. It was the weaponization of the wind, which indeed was something, and became of particularly importance as Germany tried to justify what it had done. Talk me through then how the British understood and responded to that event, so to the large-scale use of chlorine.
The interesting thing to note is we forget that the British knew the attack was coming. No one believed the Germans would actually go through with it, it seems. They had been given full warning. And yet, as soon as that happened, we see men within the higher ranks turning round to the War Cabinet, the War Office, and saying, we need to retaliate. And it's actually the British government who are the ones who seem to be on the edge because of things like the Hague Conventions. And so we're seeing in 1915 this huge dichotomy between the military men, so to speak, wanting to retaliate and retaliate in full force, and the British government sort of erring on the side of caution.
And of course, what's interesting is that what the British program would end up looking like, of course, almost seems as if it was determined, because we see World War One as an industrial war, mass production, standardization has been important aspects of it. And because we see the rise of lethal gases as almost been an inevitable consequence of the direction things were going, it's tempting to forget that, as you mentioned, there was stuff in the background for years around this. And this, to some extent, was also reflected in some of those very early discussions of potential types of retaliation, of potential types of gas. Who was behind the initial solidification of the UK's offensive program?
So what we see first is actually Sir John French, who at the time was Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, who's requesting early on a means of retaliating Germany's chlorine attack. What you've got to remember is at this time, Germany is, in terms of chemistry, an industrial powerhouse. Britain is lagging severely behind. We do not have the same capacity to be able to fulfill the requests. I think Kassel is our main factory at the time, and if you want to retaliate, they're able to do maybe 50 cylinders of chlorine a day, which when you need hundreds, if not thousands, to retaliate on a scale that Sir John French is wanting, we realise that caution the British government have, both in terms of the moral question, but also on how on earth do we manage this anyway?
And this story initially then centers on establishment and reshuffling of the chemical weapon experimental station at Porton. Is that right? This is kind of central location in the early years, at least, into kind of the emerging tactics and doctrine.
Yeah, so we see Porton emerging sort of late 15, early 1916, following Loos of September 1915, and we see this major reshuffling, and we see a second, far more important reshuffle actually come 1916 to 1917, which is when we start to see the British get a hold of its chemical industry and its CW program. And what we start to see is, as we head further into the war, they've become far more confident in their abilities, and they start to experiment a little bit more, and that connection between military front, sort of research front with Porton Down, and then the government with the Ministry of Munitions and the War Office, they all start to get a little bit closer, and it takes that reshuffle, particularly heading into Porton Down, to allow this to happen.
Initially, then, it's clear that there was discussion of gas cylinder release strategy, and there was discussion of the potential of gas-containing shells. What type of agents were being explored in the very early years before they would settle on their kind of central focal gases for production and use?
So the main thing is chlorine, obviously retaliating. So one of the little clauses hidden away in the British government's agreement that the British Army can use chemical weapons to retaliate is that we never use anything worse than what the enemy are using on us. So everything we use tends to fall in line with what Germany is using at this time. So chlorine, unsurprisingly, dominates here. Now, we are experimenting early on. In 1914, we're testing irritants already, but we're looking at fairly small scale. It's only actually Germany started bringing in mustard, which we know of. 16, 17 that we see that experimentation start to broaden. We only use as few as 5, 6 main types of chemical weapons. We've tested, I think the numbers came over 300. And we're looking at poison ivy being tested, powdered glass, nicotine. All of this is being tested, and a lot of them do, in fact, pass many of the initial testing. The failure comes into whether or not they are better or worse than what we already have on the front lines.
And it's interesting as well because I was reading a bit about the history of the French program, and they were going through a comparable process. And at some points in the conflict, they were even contacting French scientists and telling them to stop sending them samples of potential irritants and nasties to use
Yes.
because they were a bit overwhelmed. So, of course, there was some base there in terms of works on tear gases in particular, in most national contexts, because these things had been seen as potential riot control agents. And indeed, some early uses of tear gas in the First World War seem to relate to the presence of these types of troops on the front. But it's interesting when we think about what passed the test and the factors behind that, because, of course, chlorine scores very highly in the respect that it's a dual-use industrial gas, which is straightforward to produce comparatively.
Yeah.
And so it fails the test in a sense of chlorine, in many respects, is not an ideal battlefield gas. It dissipates reasonably quickly. It is lethal, but of course it's one of the easier ones to protect troops against in terms of filtering and those types of things. And so it's clear that there's that tension between them selecting for agents which were likely to be effective in terms of their profile physically, but also the ease with which they could be produced and the speed with which they could be produced, and existing systems could be adapted to produce them.
Yes, and I think that's certainly something we see very clearly in the British program. I mean, I'd mentioned powdered glass, for example. That failed because you had to powder it so finely, any effect is negligible. Things like nicotine worked brilliantly, but the sheer volume you need, you'd be producing more of that than what we already had. So for the chlorine, for example, already on the front. Therefore, you're having to weigh up the cost of producing all of this nicotine to use on the front compared to what you can get for the exact same with slightly less. It's why we see things like chlorpicrin being used so much. I mean, mustard gas, the British had already been experimenting with that before the Germans use it on the front. And it's one of the few very explicit cases you see the British Army and British scientists going against each other. British scientists have produced this, but they know they're going to struggle reproducing this on a large scale. We don't have the facilities to be able to do that. British Army, on the other hand, aren't convinced that it's even going to be a useful gas. Then Germany obviously comes forward and proves that actually it's incredibly useful.
And in this early period, there was also some double guessing on both sides. If you go to some of the earliest journalistic writings on the subject, and particular attempts to map innovation on the battlefield, you see pictures of things like illumination shells, which are mistaken for poisoned munition type things or gas generating type ammunition. So in these early days, it wasn't set in stone which way things would go. So in the early years then, you have the UK focusing primarily on its chlorine retaliatory response. You also have them exploring other agents, and you also would eventually see mustard use, which again would lead to a retaliatory expansion of that in the UK side. So obviously phosgene, as I understand it, my chemistry is not great, but that is a related gas in many respects to chlorine. When does that kind of enter the story?
So yeah, phosgene is the first attack on British troops, if I recall correctly, is December 1915. So we are following on after chlorine, which obviously comes in at the start of the year. And when it's also, we see the beginnings for the British troops on the need to use shells as opposed to cylinders. And it's what really kicks off, which I think the British do brilliantly, and it's not shared by either German or French forces is we learn how to balance our chemical shells. We produce a standardization on weight so that the men on the ground are able to use chemical shells far easier than, take French troops. Lighter shells use heavier gases, heavier shells use lighter gases, and we start to see now there are more chemicals in play on the Western Front, that there's these small sort of details that are starting to have to be explored, where communication between the military and Porton is really starting to get a lot closer to form a very effective working unit.
So in the initial years, then we saw this transition from the chlorine cylinder as a mode of delivery, and we saw this experimentation with the use of shells, which could deploy the gases in principle, a more targeted way, which potentially also meant that you could be working with smaller scales. Of course, at this point, a big issue was still the relative lethality of these things and achieving the required concentrations where you hit. So the Germans experimented with delivering phosgene in the form of shells in 1915. And at this point, then, I guess the story diverges in two directions. On the one hand, you have this continued experiment with a range of different toxic payloads, and you also see a rapid investment and exploration and production of a wide range of munition types. And we move increasingly to shell delivered gases. And that also seems to open up the potential. So we're still talking about large scale battlefield use, but as we move towards shells, we're thinking about more targeted forms of delivery, which may mean that we can use slightly smaller volumes or different types of gases to get an effect. So why don't you talk a little bit then about how the British pushed on in terms of their major stages of developing new forms of munition type?
Yeah, so the main sort of take that I got from my research for this is what we see is this all comes about as a result of a change in the way in which chemical weapons are being viewed. So gas on the Western Front has gone from, in 1915, which is the thing that actually, in terms of a popular history and remembrance of gas along the war, so many people view it as, it had to be a killer. And yet, obviously, it only, well, actually, it equated for a very small percentage of deaths in the war. But the British Army were no longer thinking of this. Once we get to shells, they start to realize the power in gas and gas shells is not in killing the enemy, it's exhausting them and it's putting them temporarily out of action. So British shells are used in two ways. We have the Special Brigade branch of the Royal Engineers, who have forms of bombs and shells. And that is used on a larger scale alongside infantry assaults. And then we have the Royal Artillery, who have obviously huge artillery pieces that are very carefully and very cleverly starting to divide the Western Front like a chessboard. Now we are no longer having waves of clouds going over the enemy lines in one mass block, like a curtain. We are now starting to pick off specific targets. I think it's the Battle of Arras in 1917. We're seeing bombardments ahead of infantry campaigns where lethal gas is being used on enemy artillery sites, and then we're having non-lethal being used during the infantry assault. Obviously, safety of one's own men is paramount. But what we're seeing is a complete silencing of enemy guns. It's a lot harder for your men to go across, obviously, if they are being attacked. And now we're starting to see that with the introduction of shells, this is becoming less and less of a problem. And we're starting to see infantry and chemical weapons working together.
And what's interesting, of course, is so with agents like phosgene, they're in the air for a while, they dissipate. With agents like mustard, you saturate the ground.
Yeah.
Any ground you were hoping to take becomes a hazard for advancing troops. So, do you start to see tactical distinctions made between? You've already alluded to some, but in particular in relation to how mustard is deployed.
For the British case, mustard comes quite late. It comes actually, I think it comes into 1918. And so at which point the war of movement is restored. And the British are very quick to realize you can't gas the ground you're wanting to occupy. And so we actually see, once mustard gas comes into play, the realization that this is no longer fitting our needs, if that makes sense. We are sending men across ground that they now cannot cross.
One of the obviously iconic British systems would be the Livens projector.
Yes.
So, could you tell me a bit about that, where it came from, its application, and perhaps the extent to which the Germans and other forces sort of emulated it?
Yeah, so this projector originally it's developed in 1916 in the Special Brigade of the Royal Engineers. To give you some very nerdy stats, it's a gun in sort of quotation marks that's about 8 inches in diameter and is placed into trenches, and you'd have somewhere between 20 and 25 that form a battery. And it's something that, unlike cylinders in their initial years, I mean, later on we did develop a way of simultaneous deployment. These batteries would be fired all at once, and you'd have these hitting targets with extraordinary accuracy, actually. It's used originally the Battle of Somme, but the Battle of Arras in 1917 is when we see it used en masse, and it caught the Germans by surprise. And it becomes a focus for the Special Brigade and all British gas operations throughout the final years of the war. It's unsurprising, in my opinion, that it's now considered one of the greatest innovations of the war, certainly for CW. And the density of the clouds, because you're firing 20 to 25 of these at once, is equal to that of cylinders. So we're realizing that the leaky cylinders that everyone wasn't liking, they were cumbersome. People thought, we're emulating Loos 1915, accidentally gassing ourselves. These were projecting those dense clouds straight into enemy lines, going deep into enemy lines, and you could be hitting, a bit like the Royal Artillery, you could be hitting quite specific targets. You can be hitting German dugouts, certain trenches, and these, in fact, were being used to hit very specific German units. I believe the 9th Bavarians got hit 14 times in the space of a year.
And what's interesting, of course, as with many aspects of the history of chemical warfare, is the relationship between the history of the Livens projector and pyrotechnics, and the fact that, as I understand it, this particular system emerges from early fire flammable incendiary weapon, which fired flammable oil drums a reasonably short distance.
Yes.
And the basic technique and the basic system was then adapted to fire gas canisters, gas shells, and also the range seems to have been improved steadily as they refined the weapon.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the only major downsides, other than the fact these are immobile, is the fact that you had to be very careful with where you place these because they give off that telltale flash. Obviously, you are firing these, and the Germans would then have to try and pick these off.
So when we get into the 1920s, there's lots of discussion about the future of gas warfare. And in particular, there's lots of, special pleading from individuals who had already invested substantial amounts of their career into gas warfare. So you'd expect those people to be banging the drum. Also, many within government had likely served on the Western Front, and so had first-hand experience of gas. And so it's not surprising that there was significant discussion of the future of that weapon system. What were the sort of tactical innovations and, I guess, the niches for use which emerged in the First World War? I guess that was the first question. And the second question were, what aspects of these translated into the conflicts which followed?
So the main tactical developments that arrived through the First World War is the ability for infantry and chemical units to work side by side. As I said, 1917, you're seeing this sort of combined arms strategy where we are seeing artillery and Royal Engineers using gas in several locations, infantry therefore able to take, because they are taking out reserve units, infantry able to take out the front. What we're seeing from, 1919, it's still used elsewhere. Obviously, the First World War, as we know, it ends, but conflicts are still happening in places. The British are still using it, and I think you mentioned people sort of advocating its use. JVS Haldane's probably one of the most famous, his Defense of Chemical Warfare, if anyone's not read it. But the problem we've seen in 1918, in 1919 is, and it's a problem we also see, why you can't use it in a conflict now, is when there's so much movement, you are limiting what you are able to do when you're gassing areas. You're already wearing men out by having them in gas masks, for limiting vision, limiting their ability to move for certain amounts of time. But you're also now placing, so 1918, for example, the big issue we had was civilians are behind German lines. Once the British are starting to advance, you can't use gas because you can't gas civilians. And that is something that we then face in the Second World War. So we know the British discussed using CW again in the Second World War, went against it. But this is one of the major issues. We can't wear your own men out. And now the proximity between civilians and the fighting front is just too small.
So I guess my question came from all that, and I think it's fascinating. There's so many different directions we can go, would be to ask you what, based on this project, which areas are you really interested in digging down into in the future? Areas which you think sort of still merit attention or are just fascinating?
For me, a large focus would have to be really drilling down in how we see the British Army working with places like Porton Down or government agencies to see how that connection brings about military innovation. Obviously, today, the large thing that everyone focuses on is drones, for example. How does the military's need bring about research back home? How does research back home influence military needs? And seeing that, so obviously, if you haven't told from my master's, I have a real intrigue in how this played in the First World War. But these set the foundations for future wars. We're still seeing this year the chloropicrine being used in supposedly in places, and how actually there is a very fine line between all these sort of sectors, and we don't always view them together. People view military innovation as, tanks, great, let's go. But actually, there's a lot more going on with tanks. There is the military need to cross the trenches, but also we're having to see the industry at home being able to produce these. And for chemical weapons especially, that's such a specific group, that chemistry industry in Britain before 1914, 1915 is not fantastic. And yet we came out of the war, in my opinion, as probably the strongest of the armies with their CW program. So it's really analysing, really drilling down into how all these little groups communicate.
Fantastic. Well, I haven't told Jess I'm going to do this, but one thing I would like to say, I'm sure she won't mind me revealing this, that Jess is on the market for a funded PhD place. Would you say that's fair, Jess?
Yes, it's certainly, yeah.
And I don't need to tell our listeners, particularly those who are academics, that we know how challenging the environment is in that respect, even for an excellent scholar such as Jess. And while we're trying our hardest this end, with my employer at least, to see if we can work something out, we are definitely interested in hearing from people who are aware of or can put us in the direction of institutions which would be in a position to invest into a historian scholar interested in particular in chemical warfare, evolution, and adaptation, and who obviously and clearly has an interest in the subject area. So, Jess, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for sharing your thesis with me. Actually, you didn't. One of my esteemed colleagues passed it on to me, and I was very excited to read it. And it's really wonderful to finally get you on the show to talk about it. If people are interested in hearing about your work and your direction of travel, where's the best place to find you on the internet?
It's a very good question. The best place would probably be on LinkedIn, Jessica Morris. I'm also on Twitter, Jess Morris 2020. And I am open, even if people just want to discuss my research, want to discuss British chemical weapons programs, British First World War history. I love it. I just absolutely love it. I think it's so interesting. So please, everyone, bombard my inbox.
Excellent. We certainly will. We've got to find our nerds and look after those people. So I'm confident you will come to regret that decision.